The morning sun crested the horizon like a golden coin tossed against the endless Texas sky, casting long shadows across the Whitmore ranch that stretched as far as the eye could see. James Whitmore stood on the weathered wooden porch of his sprawling ranch house, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his calloused hands, watching the vast expanse of prairie grass sway in the gentle breeze. The sight should have brought him satisfaction. 50,000 acres of prime Texas rangeland, 3,000 head of prime beef cattle, and a reputation that commanded respect from Fort Worth to San Antonio. Instead, it brought only the familiar hollow ache that had settled in his chest 20 years ago and never left. At 52, James bore the unmistakable marks of a life lived hard under the relentless western sun. His face was weathered leather, carved by wind and grief into sharp angles that spoke of both strength and sorrow. Gray eyes, once bright with ambition and love, now held the distant look of a man who had seen too much loss and learned to expect nothing but disappointment from life. His brown hair, now liberally streaked with silver, fell across his forehead in a way that reminded him painfully of how Sarah used to brush it back with her gentle fingers. The ranch hands whispered among themselves that he hadn't truly smiled since the fever took his wife Sarah and their unborn child 2 decades ago. Since that terrible winter when hope had died along with the 2 people who had given his life meaning, the massive ranch house had echoed with nothing but his solitary footsteps and the relentless tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a clock that Sarah had insisted they buy in Dallas during their brief happy marriage. "Boss," called out Miguel Rodriguez, his foreman, approaching with the careful respect of a man who had learned to read his employer's moods over 15 years of faithful service. Miguel was a compact man in his 40s, with intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of steady reliability that made him invaluable in managing the day-to-day operations of such a vast enterprise. The cattle count's finished. "We're looking at about 3,000 head ready for the drive to Fort Worth next month. The steers are in good condition, should bring top dollar at market." James nodded absently, his attention caught by a distant dust cloud rising against the morning sky. Something about its steady progression toward his property stirred an unease he couldn't quite name. "Good work, Miguel. Make sure the boys know they'll get their full pay plus a bonus before we head out. They've earned it." The foreman's weathered face showed surprise at this unexpected generosity, but he was wise enough not to comment. Instead, he followed his boss's gaze toward the approaching dust cloud. "Want me to send a couple of the boys to check on that?" "Not yet," James replied, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of making life and death decisions. "Let's see what develops." The Whitmore Ranch operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine, but it was a machine without soul, without the warmth that had once made it more than just a business enterprise. James had built emotional walls around his heart as strong and impenetrable as the stone fences that marked his property boundaries. He conducted his affairs with ruthless efficiency, treated his workers fairly, better than fairly, truth be told, but kept everyone at arm's length, afraid that caring too much would only lead to more loss. The townspeople in nearby Cedar Creek respected him, feared him a little, but nobody truly knew the man behind the legend. He was the cattle baron, the man who had built an empire from nothing, who could break wild horses and men with equal ease, who had never been known to back down from a fight. But he was also a man who ate his meals alone, who read by lamplight in the evenings with no one to share his thoughts, who woke each morning to silence and went to bed each night with only his regrets for company. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of blue and gold, James retreated to his study, a room that had become his sanctuary and his prison. The walls were lined with ledgers documenting 20 years of successful cattle operations, maps showing the extent of his holdings, and photographs of prize bulls and champion horses. But notably absent were any pictures of people, no family portraits, no images of friends or celebrations. It was the office of a man who had systematically eliminated anything that might remind him of what he had lost. He settled behind his massive oak desk, trying to lose himself in the familiar routine of paperwork and planning. There were bills to pay, supplies to order, correspondence with buyers in Kansas City and Chicago. The business of running a ranch this size never stopped, and James had learned to find a kind of peace in the endless details and decisions that filled his days. But today, concentration eluded him. The dust cloud he had observed that morning continued to grow larger, and through his study window he could see it moving steadily toward his property with the deliberate pace of people who had traveled far and were nearing their destination. Something about their approach unsettled him, stirring feelings he had spent 20 years learning to suppress. Outside, the ranch hands went about their daily work with the easy competence of men who knew their jobs and took pride in doing them well. Buck Thompson, the head wrangler, worked with a young horse in the corral, his patient voice carrying across the yard as he gentled the animal to accept a saddle. Tom Miller and his crew were repairing a section of fence damaged by a recent storm, their hammers ringing against the posts in a steady rhythm. In the distance, other riders moved among the scattered herds, checking for signs of disease or injury, ensuring that the cattle that represented James's fortune remained healthy and strong. It was a routine that had sustained him for 2 decades, a carefully constructed life that balanced hard work with solitude, success with emotional isolation. He had built something impressive here, something that would outlast him, but he had built it alone, and for no one but himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was one of the wealthiest men in Texas, but he had no one to share his wealth with, no one to pass it on to when he was gone. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself returning repeatedly to the window, watching the approaching figures with growing unease. The shapes were becoming clearer now, and what he saw made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was a small wagon train, moving slowly and laboriously, as if every step forward was a struggle against exhaustion and despair. When Miguel knocked on his door near sunset, the worry in his foreman's eyes confirmed what James had begun to suspect. "Boss, we've got company coming, it looks like trouble." James set down his pen and walked to the window, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. In the fading light of evening, he could make out the details now. 7 women, all visibly pregnant, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. They moved with the desperate determination of people who had reached the end of their rope, their wagon creaking under the weight of their few possessions and the burden of whatever circumstances had driven them to seek refuge at his isolated ranch. For the first time in 20 years, James Whitmore felt something shift in the careful structure of his existence. The walls he had built around his heart showed the first hairline crack, and through that crack he felt the stirring of something he had thought dead and buried, the capacity to care about someone other than himself. Tomorrow, he realized with a mixture of dread and anticipation, everything would change. The question was whether he was strong enough to survive it. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The morning air carried the crisp promise of autumn as James Whitmore stood at his bedroom window, watching the small procession finally reach the entrance to his property. He had dressed with unusual care, his hands betraying a nervousness he hadn't felt in years as he buttoned his best shirt and ran a comb through his graying hair. 20 years of solitude had not prepared him for this moment, for the sight of 7 pregnant women standing at his gate like refugees from some distant catastrophe. The women clustered around their weathered wagon, their faces gaunt with hunger and marked by the kind of exhaustion that comes from days of travel across the harsh Texas landscape. Their clothes, though clean and carefully mended, spoke of reduced circumstances and long hardship, but there was something in their bearing, in the way they held themselves despite their obvious desperation, that spoke of dignity and inner strength that poverty and fear had not been able to destroy. The oldest among them stepped forward with the determined grace of a natural leader. Rebecca Morrison was a woman in her 30s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Despite her obvious pregnancy and the fatigue that lined her face, she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions and bearing responsibility for others. James made his way slowly down the gravel path from his house to the gate, his boots crunching on the stones in a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The women watched his approach with a mixture of hope and apprehension, their hands instinctively moving to protect their swollen bellies, as if shielding their unborn children from whatever judgment he might pass upon them. "Sir," Rebecca called out, her voice hoarse from travel but steady with resolve. "I'm Rebecca Morrison. We've come a long way and we need help." She gestured to the other women behind her, each one a story of hardship and determination. "We have nowhere else to go." James stopped a few feet from the gate, his weathered face carefully composed in the expression of stern authority he had cultivated over decades of dealing with business associates and potential troublemakers. "This is private property, ma'am. There's a town about 15 miles back that way." He pointed toward the east, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Please." Another woman stepped forward, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. She was young, perhaps 22, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that reminded him painfully of Sarah. Mary Henderson was her name, though he wouldn't learn it until later. "We can't go back there. They'll find us if we do. All we need is a place to rest, to have our babies safely. We can work. We can earn our keep." "I don't need workers," James interrupted. But even as he spoke the words, he could hear the lack of conviction in his own voice. Something in the young woman's eyes, the way she looked at him with a mixture of desperation and hope, was awakening feelings he had spent 20 years trying to bury. Rebecca Morrison straightened her shoulders, and James could see the steel beneath her exhausted exterior. "Mr. Whitmore, I know who you are. I know." I know you've lived alone since your wife passed, and I know you have a reputation as a hard man, but these women are carrying innocent lives, and we're asking for nothing more than Christian mercy." The use of his name surprised him. Few people outside of Cedar Creek and the business community knew who he was, and fewer still would dare to approach him directly. "How do you know my name?" "Word travels even in country this big. You have a reputation as a fair man, if not a friendly one." Rebecca paused, studying his face with the keen insight of someone who had learned to read people's intentions quickly and accurately. "We're not asking for charity, Mr. Whitmore. We'll work for our keep, help with whatever needs doing around the ranch. But sir, we need shelter, and we need it soon." James looked at each woman in turn, seeing not just their obvious pregnancy, but the individual stories written in their faces. There was Susan Walsh, a woman in her mid-20s with kind eyes and capable hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Emma Chen, quiet and thoughtful, with the bearing of someone who had received education before circumstances had reduced her to this desperate flight. Catherine Dubois, whose French accent became apparent when she spoke, carrying herself with a grace that suggested better days in her past. Isabel Rodriguez, whose dark eyes held both fear and fierce determination, and Rose Parker, the youngest of them all, barely 18, with a spirit that shone through her exhaustion like sunlight through storm clouds. "What are you running from?" James asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The women exchanged glances, and James could see the fear that flickered across their faces like shadows. Rebecca Morrison's jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of bitter experience. "Men who think they own us, who think our children belong to them, men who have money and power, and believe that gives them the right to use people like property." The implication hung in the air between them, and James felt the familiar rage that had been his constant companion since Sarah's death begin to stir. He had heard whispers of such things in the saloons of Fort Worth and Dallas. Wealthy men who preyed on vulnerable women, who used their influence to escape the consequences of their actions. The thought of it made his hands clench into fists. "I don't run a boarding house," he said finally, but his voice had lost its harsh edge. "This is a working ranch, and I have my own problems to deal with." "We know," Rebecca replied, hope beginning to kindle in her eyes. "And we're willing to work. Mary there has a way with animals. She can help with the horses and cattle. Susan can cook and clean better than any woman you'll find in 3 counties. Emma can read and write, keep books if you need it. We all have skills, Mr. Whitmore. We just need a chance to prove ourselves." James stood silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him like a physical force. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to send them on their way, to maintain the isolation that had protected him from further hurt for 20 years. But as he looked at these women, as he saw the life growing within them, and the courage that had brought them to his door, he thought of Sarah and the child they had lost, and he felt something crack in the wall around his heart. "The house has 7 spare rooms," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I have rules. You work for your keep, you don't interfere with ranch business, and you keep your troubles to yourselves. I won't have violence brought to my property." The relief that flooded the women's faces was like sunrise after a long night. Rebecca Morrison's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. "Thank you," she whispered. "You won't regret this decision." As James unlocked the gate and swung it open, the heavy iron hinges creaking in protest, he wondered if that was true. For the first time in 20 years, the Whitmore Ranch would have the sound of women's voices echoing through its halls, the promise of new life growing within its walls. As he led them toward the house, their wagon wheels crunching on the gravel drive, he felt the familiar world he had built around himself beginning to shift and change. The women followed him in respectful silence, their eyes taking in the impressive scope of his property, the well-maintained buildings, the quality of the livestock, the evidence of prosperity earned through hard work and careful management. But James found himself seeing it through their eyes, noticing not just the success he had built, but the emptiness that success had cost him. As they approached the house, Rebecca Morrison fell into step beside him. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that we understand what you're risking by taking us in. If our troubles follow us here, we'll leave rather than bring harm to you or your ranch." James glanced at her, seeing the sincerity in her weathered face. "Ma'am, I've been alone for 20 years. I reckon I can handle whatever trouble you might bring." He paused, then added more softly, "Besides, a house this big was meant to have people in it." And for the first time in 2 decades, James Whitmore opened his front door not to emptiness and silence, but to the sound of women's voices and the promise of life beginning anew. Chapter 3. The Wakening. 3 weeks had passed since the 7 women arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The house that had echoed with the hollow sound of one man's footsteps for 20 years now pulsed with life. The gentle murmur of women's voices discussing the day's work, the clatter of dishes being prepared for communal meals, the soft rustle of fabric as they moved through rooms that had known only masculine silence for far too long. James found himself walking differently through his own home, stepping more quietly, pausing to listen to conversations that drifted from the kitchen or the sitting room. He had become an observer of life rather than a participant, watching with fascination as these women transformed his austere bachelor's quarters into something that felt, for the first time in decades, like a home. Rebecca Morrison had proven to be a natural organizer, coordinating the women's efforts with the efficiency of a military commander. She had assessed each woman's strengths and assigned tasks accordingly, creating a household routine that functioned with smooth precision. Her own background, James had learned, included several years of nursing training before circumstances had forced her into her current situation. She had tended to the minor injuries and ailments of the ranch hands with professional competence, earning their respect and gratitude. Mary Henderson had indeed shown remarkable skill with animals, spending her days in the stables and corrals, her gentle touch and intuitive understanding of horse behavior, making her invaluable to the ranch's operations. Buck Thompson, the head wrangler, had initially been skeptical of having a pregnant woman working around the horses, but Mary's natural ability had quickly won him over. She had a gift for calming nervous animals and seemed to understand their needs and moods better than men who had worked with horses for decades. Susan Walsh had transformed the kitchen into a warm, inviting space where the smell of fresh bread and hearty stews filled the air. Her cooking had become legendary among the ranch hands, who now worked with new enthusiasm, knowing that excellent meals awaited them at the end of each day. She had a gift for making even simple ingredients into something special, and her cheerful presence had brought warmth to a room that had been purely functional for 20 years. Emma Chen, quiet and thoughtful, had taken to reading in the evenings by the fireplace, her presence adding a sense of peaceful contemplation to the main room. James had discovered that she had received a considerable education before her circumstances had changed, and her intelligent observations about the books in his library had led to several conversations that he found surprisingly engaging. Catherine Dubois had proven to be a natural storyteller, her voice carrying tales of her childhood in Louisiana that made even the hardened ranch hands pause in their work to listen. Her French accent and graceful mannerisms spoke of a more cultured background, and her stories of New Orleans before the war had given James glimpses of a world he had never known. Isabel Rodriguez had insisted on helping with the ranch's bookkeeping, her neat handwriting and careful attention to detail bringing order to ledgers that had been James's solitary domain for years. She had a head for numbers and business that impressed him, and her suggestions for improving the ranch's operations had already proven valuable. And Rose Parker, barely 18 and the youngest of the group, had brought a spirit to the house that reminded James painfully of Sarah. She sang while she worked, her voice carrying melodies that seemed to breathe life into the very walls. Her laughter had become the soundtrack of the ranch, and her irrepressible optimism had begun to chip away at the cynicism that had protected James's heart for so long. On this particular evening, James sat in his study, trying to concentrate on preparations for the upcoming cattle drive to Fort Worth, when he heard Rose's voice raised in distress from the kitchen. He dropped his pen and rushed toward the sound, his heart pounding with a fear that surprised him with its intensity. He found Rose doubled over beside the kitchen table, gripping its edge with white-knuckled hands, her face pale with pain and shock. "The baby," she gasped, looking up at him with eyes wide with fear and confusion. I think it's coming." James felt his blood turn to ice, his mind immediately transported back to that terrible night 20 years ago, when Sarah had gone into labor too early, when he had been helpless to save either her or their child. The memory of that night, of his complete powerlessness in the face of medical crisis, had haunted him for decades. "Rebecca," he called out, his voice carrying through the house with an urgency that brought all the women running. They moved with the swift efficiency of people who had faced crisis before, their individual strengths combining into a collective competence that took over the situation. Rebecca Morrison arrived within seconds, her nursing training evident in the way she immediately assessed Rose's condition with calm professionalism. "Emma, boil water, lots of it. Catherine, get the clean linens from the closet upstairs. Susan, clear the table in the kitchen and scrub it down. We'll need the space." As the women worked with practiced coordination, James found himself standing uselessly in the doorway, his hands trembling with the memory of another night, another woman in pain, another moment when he had been powerless to help. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Rebecca looked up at him with understanding eyes. "Stay close," she said gently. "This is her first child and she's scared. Rose trusts you. Sometimes just having someone strong nearby helps more than all the medical knowledge in the world." The labor continued through the night, with Rose crying out during the strongest contractions, her hand gripping James's with surprising strength. Between the waves of pain, she would look up at him with exhausted eyes and whisper words of gratitude that broke his heart. "Thank you for letting us stay. Thank you for giving my baby a safe place to be born." James sat beside her, holding her hand and murmuring words of encouragement, marveling at the strength she showed in the face of such overwhelming pain. He had seen men break under pressure that was far less intense than what this young woman was enduring, yet she faced each contraction with courage that humbled him. As dawn broke over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a new sound filled the Whitmore ranch, the thin, protesting cry of a newborn baby. James stood in the doorway as Rebecca lifted the tiny, red-faced infant, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 20 years, a sound he had thought he would never hear again. "It's a girl," Rebecca announced, her own voice thick with emotion as she cleaned the baby with gentle efficiency. A healthy, beautiful girl, Rose, exhausted but radiant with joy, held her daughter for the first time, her face transformed by a love so pure and powerful that James felt his own heart crack open with the force of it. "Elizabeth," she whispered, looking down at the tiny face with wonder. "Her name is Elizabeth." In the days that followed, the ranch was transformed yet again. The sound of a baby's cry became the new rhythm of the household, punctuating the daily routines with reminders of life's most fundamental miracle. Tiny clothes appeared on the washing line, fluttering in the Texas breeze like flags of hope. The women took turns caring for Elizabeth, their faces softening with maternal instincts that transcended their own conditions. James found himself lingering in the kitchen during meals, something he had never done before. He listened to the women's conversations about their hopes for their children, their plans for the future, their dreams of lives free from the fear that had driven them to his door. He began to smile, actually smile, for the first time in 20 years, usually when baby Elizabeth would look up at him with curious dark eyes, or when one of the women would ask for his advice on some matter. The change in him was not lost on his men. Miguel Rodriguez, who had worked for him for 15 years, noticed it immediately. "Boss, you seem different. Happier, maybe?" James considered this as he watched Rose walking in the garden, her daughter in her arms, both of them bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "Maybe I am, Miguel. Maybe I am." He had begun to realize that the walls he had built around his heart had not protected him from pain. They had only protected him from joy. And watching these women, seeing their strength and resilience in the face of adversity, seeing the life they had brought to his empty house, he understood that some risks were worth taking. But even as happiness began to return to his life, James couldn't shake the feeling that this fragile peace was temporary. The women still jumped at unexpected sounds, still looked over their shoulders when they worked outside. Whatever they were running from hadn't disappeared just because they had found shelter, and in the distance, dust clouds continued to appear on the horizon, reminding him that the outside world, with all its dangers and complications, was never very far away. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning in early September, when the oppressive heat of the Texas summer was beginning to give way to the cooler promise of autumn. James was in the main stable with Mary Henderson, examining a prize mare that had thrown a shoe, when Miguel Rodriguez burst through the wide doors with the kind of urgency that meant real danger was approaching. "Boss, riders coming hard from the east," Miguel reported, his usually calm demeanor cracked by obvious concern. "Maybe 10 or 12 of them, all armed and moving like they've got serious business here." James felt his blood turn to ice, the familiar weight of dread settling in his stomach. He had known this day would come, had seen it in the haunted looks the women still carried despite weeks of relative safety, heard it in the way they would stop talking when he entered a room unexpectedly. The past had a way of catching up with people, no matter how far they ran. "Get the women into the house," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Tell them to stay away from the windows. And Miguel, make sure the boys are ready. I don't know what's coming, but I want to be prepared for anything." Mary Henderson, who had been holding the mare's hoof, looked up at him with fear in her green eyes. "It's him, isn't it? It's Caldwell." James had heard the name whispered among the women in recent weeks, usually followed by looks of terror and conversations that died when he approached. Marcus Caldwell, a name that carried weight in East Texas, though not the kind of weight that honest men respected. "How many men does he usually travel with?" "Enough," Mary replied grimly, her hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. "He's got money, influence, and he's not used to being told no. He thinks he owns people, Mr. Whitmore. He thinks he owns us." Rebecca Morrison met James at the front door of the house, her face pale but determined. The weeks of good food and rest had restored much of her strength, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. "It's him, isn't it? It's Caldwell." James nodded, studying her face. "Tell me about him. Everything you know." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. "Marcus Caldwell owns the biggest plantation in East Texas. After the war, when slavery was abolished, he found other ways to acquire labor. He targets women who are desperate, vulnerable, offers them shelter, food, protection in exchange for signing contracts they don't understand. What kind of contracts? The kind that sign away their freedom, their children, their lives. He's clever about it, uses legal language that sounds legitimate but creates situations where the women can never fulfill their obligations. They become trapped, owing him more than they can ever repay. James felt a familiar rage building in his chest. How many women has he done this to? Dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. We 7 managed to escape, but there are others still there, still trapped by his contracts and his threats. Rebecca's voice grew harder. He calls it his breeding program. He believes he's creating a superior class of children that he can raise as his own heirs. The implications hit James like a physical blow. He's talking about slavery, legal slavery, Rebecca corrected bitterly. He's careful to stay within the letter of the law, even if he violates its spirit completely. The contracts are technically valid. The local authorities are either bought or intimidated, and the women who try to escape are hunted down and returned as fugitives. The dust cloud grew larger as the riders approached, and James could make out the details now. Well-dressed men on expensive horses, the kind of outfit that spoke of money and power. At their head rode a man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of ownership and value. James stepped onto his porch, his own men beginning to gather behind him. Miguel and the ranch hands might not have known the full story, but they recognized the threat when they saw it. These were not casual visitors or traveling businessmen. These were men who had come for something specific, and they were prepared to use force to get it. The riders stopped at the gate, and the silver-haired man dismounted with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way in all things. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most men earned in a year, but there was something in his bearing that suggested violence lay just beneath the civilized surface. "James Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and position. "I'm Marcus Caldwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me." James stepped to the edge of his porch, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "This is private property, Caldwell. State your business or move on." Caldwell smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey. "I'm looking for 7 women who left my employ without proper notice. I'm told they've taken refuge here, along with valuable property that belongs to me." "I don't know what you're talking about," James replied evenly, though his heart was pounding with anger and anticipation. "Come now, Whitmore. We both know that's not true. I've been tracking them for weeks, following their trail across half of Texas. They're carrying valuable property, my property, and I want it back." The words hit James like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "I don't see any property here that belongs to you." Caldwell's smile widened, and James could see the cruelty that lay beneath his civilized veneer. "Ah, but you do. You see, those women signed contracts with me, legal contracts that make them and their children my property until certain debts are paid. They took my money, lived in my houses, ate my food. In return, they agreed to provide me with heirs, legal heirs that I can claim and raise as my own." James felt something snap inside him, a fury so pure and intense that it took all his self-control not to draw his gun and end this conversation permanently. "You're talking about slavery. I'm talking about business," Caldwell corrected smoothly. "Legal business. Those women entered into agreements with me voluntarily, and I intend to see those agreements honored. They've cost me considerable time and money to track down, and I expect to be compensated for my trouble." Behind him, James could hear the women gathering at the windows despite his orders, could feel their fear radiating from the house like heat from a forge. Baby Elizabeth began to cry, and he heard Rose's voice trying to soothe her, the sound cutting through him like a knife. "The contracts are void," James said finally. "Those women are free to make their own choices." "Are they?" Caldwell reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather portfolio, extracting a sheaf of official-looking papers. "I have legal documents here that say otherwise. Bills of sale, debt agreements, promissory notes, all properly notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities." James studied the papers, knowing that they were probably technically legal despite being morally reprehensible. Caldwell had money, influence, and lawyers who knew how to navigate the complexities of post-war Texas law. "What do you want?" "Simple. The women come back with me, along with any children they may have birthed. Their debts will be considered paid after they've served their full terms and provided me with the heirs I was promised. They'll be well cared for, I assure you." The casual way he spoke of human beings as property made James's vision blur with rage. "And if I refuse?" Caldwell's smile turned predatory. "Then I'll be forced to involve the authorities. I have sheriff's warrants here for their arrest on charges of theft, breach of contract and fraud. I also have witnesses who will testify that they stole from me before they left. The penalties for such crimes are quite severe. James looked at the papers in Caldwell's hand, understanding the trap that had been so carefully constructed. Even if the contracts were morally wrong, they were probably legally binding. Caldwell had money, influence, and the law on his side. He could make life very difficult for the women, and for James himself, if he chose to fight. "I'll need time to consider this," James said finally, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them. "Of course, I'm a reasonable man, Whitmore, but don't take too long. I have other business to attend to, and I'm not known for my patience." Caldwell remounted his horse with fluid grace. "I'll be back tomorrow morning for my property. I trust you'll have made the right decision by then." As the riders disappeared into the distance, James stood on his porch, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Behind him, he could hear the women crying, could feel their desperation and fear. For the first time in 20 years, he had something worth fighting for, people who depended on him for protection. The question was whether he was strong enough to save them, or whether he would fail them just as he had failed Sarah all those years ago. Chapter 5. The Stand. The night passed without sleep for anyone at the Whitmore Ranch. James spent the dark hours in his study, cleaning and checking every weapon he owned, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. The women huddled together in the main room, taking turns holding baby Elizabeth and whispering prayers for their uncertain future. Outside, the ranch hands maintained a careful watch, their loyalty to James extending to the protection of the women who had brought life back to their employer. As dawn broke over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, James gathered everyone in the kitchen. His face was grim but determined, and the women could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a sense of purpose that had been missing for 20 years. "I've made my decision," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "You're not going back with Caldwell, not while I draw breath." Rebecca Morrison was the first to speak, her voice heavy with concern. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't understand what you're up against. Caldwell has money, influence, legal papers that might hold up in court. He can make your life very difficult, maybe even destroy you." "Maybe," James replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I've learned something these past weeks. I've learned that some things are worth fighting for, even if the odds are against you, especially when the odds are against you." Rose Parker, still weak from childbirth but fierce in her determination, held Elizabeth closer to her chest. "We won't let you risk everything for us. We can run again, find somewhere else to hide." "No." James's voice was final, carrying the weight of a man who had found his purpose after 20 years of aimless existence. "You've done enough running. This is your home now, and I protect what's mine." The simple word, mine, hung in the air with surprising weight. For the first time, the women understood that they weren't just refugees seeking temporary shelter. They had become family to this lonely man, and he would defend them with everything he had. Miguel Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his face tense with urgency. "Boss, Caldwell's coming back. Looks like he brought more men this time, maybe 15 or 20 riders. But there's something else. Sheriff Bradley's riding in from the west with a group from town." James felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. Tom Bradley was an honest man in a region where honesty was often in short supply, but he was also bound by law and legal precedent. "Any idea what brings the sheriff out here?" "Can't say for sure, but word is that someone's been asking questions about Caldwell's business practices. A federal judge from Austin, apparently." As the riders approached from both directions, James could see that this confrontation would be different from the previous day's encounter. Caldwell had indeed brought reinforcements, but Sheriff Bradley's presence changed the dynamics significantly. Caldwell dismounted with the same arrogant confidence as before, but James noticed a tension in his bearing that hadn't been there yesterday. The silver-haired man's eyes kept flicking toward the approaching sheriff, and for the first time, he seemed less certain of his position. "Whitmore," Caldwell called out, his voice carrying forced authority, "I trust you've made the right decision. I'm here to collect my property and return to my business." Sheriff Tom Bradley, a weathered man in his 60s who had known James for years, rode up before James could respond. "Morning, James." Caldwell. He tipped his hat with the careful courtesy of a man who understood the delicate nature of his position. "I've got some interesting news that might affect this situation." "What kind of news, Sheriff?" James asked, hope beginning to kindle in his chest. Bradley dismounted and pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Got word from Austin yesterday. Seems a federal judge has been reviewing some of the contract cases coming out of East Texas. Judge Marcus Hoffman, specifically. He's issued a ruling that might interest you, Caldwell." Caldwell's face went pale, but he maintained his composure. "What kind of ruling?" "The kind that says you can't contract someone into slavery, even if they're desperate enough to sign. Judge called your business practices unconscionable and contrary to public policy and the laws of Texas. He's voided every contract you've forced on vulnerable women. James felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly knocked him to his knees. You hear that, Caldwell? Looks like your legal documents aren't worth the paper they're printed on. Caldwell's composure cracked, revealing the ugly reality beneath his civilized veneer. You think this is over? I have influence, connections throughout the state. I can make trouble for all of you. More trouble than you can imagine. Maybe, Sheriff Bradley said calmly, pulling out a second document. But you'll have to do it from a jail cell. I've got federal warrants here for your arrest on charges of human trafficking, fraud, intimidation, and conspiracy. The judge was quite thorough in his investigation. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Caldwell's men, faced with the choice between a gunfight with federal law enforcement or finding new employment, chose wisely. Several of them actually seemed relieved to be free of their employer's influence. Within minutes, Caldwell found himself in handcuffs, his threats reduced to impotent rage. This isn't over, he snarled as the sheriff led him away. I'll find a way to make you pay for this, Whitmore. All of you. I reckon we'll deal with that when the time comes, James replied quietly. But for now you're done hurting people. As the sheriff's party disappeared into the distance, James felt a hand slip into his. Rose Parker stood beside him, Elizabeth in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. For giving us a home, for protecting us, for believing we were worth fighting for. One by one, the other women joined them on the porch, their faces bright with relief and gratitude. Rebecca Morrison, who had held them together through their darkest hours, smiled at James with genuine warmth. You gave us more than shelter, Mr. Whitmore. You gave us hope and dignity and a chance to build real lives. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore Ranch settled into a new rhythm that felt both natural and transformative. The women, no longer haunted by the fear of being hunted, threw themselves into making the ranch not just a place of work, but a true home. Rose's daughter Elizabeth became the center of attention, passed from loving arms to loving arms, her laughter echoing through rooms that had known only silence for too long. Mary Henderson proved so skilled with the horses that James made her the ranch's official horse trainer, a position that came with its own house and a salary that ensured her independence. Susan Walsh's reputation as a cook spread throughout the region, and she began taking orders from neighboring ranches for special occasions, building a small but profitable business. Emma Chen established a school in one of the ranch's outbuildings, teaching not only the children of the ranch workers but also youngsters from the surrounding area. Her quiet intelligence and patient manner made her beloved by both students and parents.